Great. So welcome everybody. Good afternoon, good evening maybe, and good morning, I think, possibly to some of you. And welcome to the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, known as CAPI, at the University of Victoria. For the few of you who on the call who don't know me, I think many of you have seen me before. I'm Victor Ramraj. I'm CAPI's director. And for those of you who might be joining a CAPI event for the first time, we're a dynamic, interdisciplinary, Asia-focused research center located in Victoria, BC, on Canada's west coast and on Coast Salish territory. I'm on the campus today, so let me take a moment to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'm delighted to welcome you to yet another exciting event organized by CAPI's Senior Research Fellow, Associate Global History Professor and Canada Research Chair, Dr. Neilesh Bose. Dr. Bose has organized a number of seminars and events for CAPI over the years under the banner of the South Asia Global Forum and the Global South Colloquium. This particular term, he has organized this impressive lecture series in conjunction with his class. It's called Punjab in the World, History, Politics and Migration. And I think many on the call are already now familiar with this series. It's been one really not to miss. And in a moment, I will turn things over to Dr. Bose, Neilesh, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Natasha Behl from Arizona State University, who will be speaking to us on the farmer protests in India. But I thought I would take this opportunity to offer a few very brief thoughts of my own. I should say that many of us have been following the farmer protest saga from a distance, particularly since for anyone, it raises these profound questions about protests and governance generally. And with so many protests in Asia and around the world, I'm thinking of the umbrella movement in Hong Kong before the pandemic, political reform protests in Bangkok under the umbrella of what's been called the milk tea movement. And then closer to home, the storming of the US Capitol, the Freedom Convoy protests in Ottawa in February, which inspired similar protests in New Zealand. And now more recently, anti-war protests in Moscow. I can't imagine a more topical subject. I actually saw, as I was preparing for this, a recent study by Isabel Ortiz and her colleagues, which was published in November of last year, confirming what many of us have sensed, that the number of protests globally has doubled between 2006 and 2020. So I think the farmer protests offer us an opportunity to focus on the complex relationship between these kinds of social movements and activist movements and the questions of governance, specifically in the context of India, and to ask difficult questions about how public institutions can respond to those kinds of protests. So I don't know if you're going to answer all of those questions, but certainly it's a fascinating topic. We're absolutely privileged to have you here today. So a very warm welcome to CAPI and to you, Vic. Neilesh, thanks again for organizing the talk and the series, and over to you to introduce our guest and explain the format and to moderate the session. So handing the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Victor. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 10th presentation of the Punjab in the World History, Politics and Migration series. And this series explores the modern history of the Punjab as well as Punjabi migrations in global and transnational contexts. And for those of you who are new to this program, the series has featured scholars from a range of disciplines, including historians who work on topics like the Sikh Empire, colonial Punjab, aspects of the military and colonial recruitment, as well as those who work on aspects of migration to Canada, to North America, broadly speaking, and different parts of the world, as well as popular and visual culture. My name is Neilesh Bose. For those of you who have not seen me before, convener of the series, host of the program, and I teach South Asian and global history here at the University of Victoria, where I'm sitting with my students, some of my students who are here, others who are connecting by Zoom. So about the protocol for today, in keeping with our recent traditions, the speaker will speak for the first part of the program, approximately half an hour, 30 to 35 minutes, followed by an open Q&A moderated by myself, and we will endeavor to finish the program at 5 p.m. Pacific time. The chat is disabled, and I will ask everybody who has questions to please hold them until the very end, and to please use the digital hand raise function, so I may call on people in order. And so everybody knows the program is being recorded, so I will ask everybody to ensure that their audio is turned off during the presentation. Now, it is a great pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Professor Natasha Behl, an associate professor of political science at Arizona State University, and she specializes in questions of race, ethnicity, and comparative politics. Her book, Gendered Citizenship: Understanding Gendered Violence in Democratic India, received the American Political Science Association's 2021 Lee Ann Fuji Award for Innovation in the Interpretive Study of Political Violence. Professor Behl has published widely in academic and popular venues on a variety of topics, and has received numerous awards for her teaching and her faculty mentoring, and has published work on the protests in venues like the Washington Post and Economic and Political Weekly in India, and has also delivered a very interesting TED Talk. She has served on a panel here at the University of Victoria Center for Global Studies about 1 year ago on the topic of farmers' protests. It was a panel that I had the great privilege of chairing. And now, a year later, she will speak to us on the topic of farmers' protests, updates, and approaches. And I now turn the Zoom room over to Professor Behl.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I also want to just say that this course is absolutely incredible, and I wish that it existed when I was doing my undergraduate training and my graduate school training. Often Punjab is not is relegated to the kind of margins in South Asian studies and Indian studies. And to see a course that centers Punjab in this way, right, to try to understand the histories, migrations, and politics, right, of South Asia is just incredible. And so I'm so grateful that I get to be part of this series, and it really is an honor to come and speak about the farmers' protest. So what I'll do is begin with my kind of prepared remarks, and then I'll also share a protest song. And so I'll share my screen and share a protest song to give you a sense of the protest, and then move into that kind of end with that question and answer period. So India, the world's largest democracy, has been experiencing a democratic decline. Multiple organizations have downgraded India to a partly free or flawed democracy, signaling that its electoral integrity is at risk, while others are actually now classifying it as not a democracy at all, but as an electoral autocracy. Since coming to power in 2014 and winning re-election in 2019, Prime Minister Modi and the BJP have become increasingly illiberal and authoritarian. The rule of law has deteriorated, rights and liberties have been curtailed, and the media and scholars have been silenced. Following the 2014 elections, Some scholars actually argued that electoral constraints and constitutional realities would push the BJP's Hindu nationalist agenda towards a more kind of centrist position. Others argued that public intellectuals, judicial independence, and media outlets would be formidable impediments to the BJP's implementation of its anti-secular vision. Still, others argued that the BJP's politics of resentment against minorities would not be sustainable, neither over time nor across regions in India. Since the 2019 elections, however, India's descent towards illiberalism has accelerated. The BJP has become India's most powerful party, while the opposition parties have weakened, judicial independence has been undermined, and the once vibrant press has become compliant. If electoral constraint, constitutional design, judicial independence, and a free press haven't slowed India's march towards illiberalism, what can? In November 2020, India's farmers began a massive and highly organized protest against the government. In this talk, I ask, in what ways has this protest protected Indian democracy from further degradation? And has it radically altered India's political future? So let me talk a little bit about the kind of illiberalism and authoritarianism that we're seeing in India. Since coming to power in 2014, the BJP has used legal and extra-legal mechanisms to undermine democracy. State-sanctioned violence against Muslims has intensified, while crackdowns on dissent have also intensified. Furthermore, Hindu vigilantism has been on the rise. The BJP has delegated cultural policing to Hindu nationalist groups, which attack minorities, elites, and others with near impunity. In addition, the BJP has used existing laws on sedition, defamation, counterterrorism to demonize targeted minorities, deprive them of their citizenship rights, and turn them into non-citizens. Since winning re-election in 2019, the party has passed laws that specifically target minority communities, such as the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act and the Citizenship Amendment Act. The outcome has been an erosion of pluralism, secularism, and equality in India's multicultural democracy through both de facto and de jure mechanisms. Modi and the BJP, in short, have been driving India towards authoritarianism. The banning of protest songs is one example of the BJP's illiberalism. Kanwar Garewal's Elan was removed from YouTube because it became an anthem at the protests, especially the line, Faslan de Faisle Kisan Karange, Faslan de Faisle Kisan Karuga, or farming decisions will be made by the farmer. I'm sharing another protest song entitled Badshah to provide a visual representation of the protests while also sharing the Sikh sensibility that is pervasive in the movement. And so this is, let's see.
ਹੋ ਸੇ ਹੀ ਰਾਤੇ ਤੁਰ ਪਏ ਪੁੱਤ ਤੇਗ ਬਹਾਦਰ ਦੇ ਬਰਸੇ ਕੋਈ ਨੂਰ ਇਲਾਹੀ ਦਿੱਲੀ ਦੇ ਬਾਰਡਰ ਤੇ ਬਰਸੇ ਕੋਈ ਨੂਰ ਇਲਾਹੀ
ਉਸੇ ਹੀ ਰਾਤੇ ਤੁਰ ਪਏ ਪੁੱਤ ਤੇਗ ਬਹਾਦਰ ਦੇ ਬਰਸੇ ਕੋਈ ਨੂਰ ਇਲਾਹੀ ਦਿੱਲੀ ਦੇ ਬਾਰਡਰ ਤੇ ਬਰਸੇ ਕੋਈ ਨੂਰ ਇਲਾਹੀ
ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਫਤਿਹ ਸਿੰਘ ਦੀਆਂ ਝਲਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਾਤਸ਼ਾਹ
ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਕਿਲੇ ਬਣ ਗਈਆਂ ਸੜਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਾਤਸ਼ਾਹ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਕਿਲੇ ਬਣ ਗਈਆਂ ਸੜਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਾਤਸ਼ਾਹ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਕਿਲੇ ਬਣ ਗਈਆਂ
So let me give you a sense of what you just heard and saw. So in Patsha, the singers, let me, I guess, give you a bit of a translation of what they're saying. Are you hearing something in the background? I'm hearing the noise. You're not hearing anything? No. Okay, sorry. Okay. So what the song is saying is, we, the sons of martyred Guru Tegh Bahadur, walk along his path as the divine light of God reigns over the borders of Delhi, as the divine light of God reigns over. In our children, we see glimpses of Fateh Singh, Guru Gobind Singh's martyred son, O Lord. Roads have become our fortresses, O Lord. Roads have become our fortresses, O Lord. Roads have become our fortresses. The Indian Constitution, adopted in 1950, is a highly inclusive democratic constitution, offering citizenship to women, illiterates, lower castes, and other marginalized groups, and promising equality to religious minorities. Yet, the framers of the Indian Constitution eliminated provisions that would have ensured the political viability of minorities. And in doing so, they created a model of multicultural democracy that consolidated Hindu majority group domination. Indian constitutional design, combined with the BJP's current electoral dominance and authoritarian measures, has catalyzed the current crisis in Indian democracy. And this decline of democracy might signal more broadly that liberal democracies under late capitalism cannot flourish amid ethnic and religious diversity. It might also signal a pervasive democratic weakening and a global ascendancy of authoritarian populism. And yet, the farmers' protest has provided an alternative vision of democracy, one rooted in radical egalitarianism. Protesting farmers have actualized the spirit of dissent enshrined in the Indian Constitution by holding the current government accountable to it. Protesters have also developed inclusive forms of solidarity, demonstrating the possibility of more equitable forms of democracy. I argue that social justice movements like the farmers' protests can lead to a deepening of democracy and perhaps to the promise of a more radical democracy. Movements such as Occupy Wall Street, Gezi Park, and Shaheen Bagh pushed back against increasing illiberalism through inclusive forms of protest that experimented with alternative models of democracy. The farmers' protest has engaged in similar experiments. So I'll give you a bit of like a background of the laws themselves, and then give you a sense of how the protest emerged nationally. So in September 2020, the Indian Parliament passed 3 agricultural reform bills, concerning the pricing, sale, and storage of farm products. These laws deregulated and privatized India's agrarian economy. The BJP asserted that the reforms would provide farmers with more choice within the agricultural market by giving them the option to sell directly to private companies while freeing them from the traditional wholesale mandis or markets. Yet farmers feared that the reforms would lower the prices for their products and remove an essential safety net. The likely outcome of these laws would be the collapse of the public agricultural system, which would jeopardize small farmers' livelihood and the nation's food security. Specifically, the reforms would collapse the mandi system, which currently guarantees farmers a minimum support price or MSP. During the first few years of reform, private corporations would likely purchase agricultural goods at a price surpassing MSP, which would secure them monopoly power in the market. They could then set prices far lower than MSP, which would likely have devastating consequences for Indian farmers, 85% of whom own less than 5 acres of land. These farmers, who have already been overwhelmed by debt and suicide in recent decades, would need to compete in a market that favors corporations. Many farmers would likely lose their land, their livelihoods, and their way of life. In response, protesting farmers have demanded that the government repeal the 3 farm laws and legalize a national MSP index for farm produce. On November 26, 2020, the movement emerged nationally through 2 distinct organizational tactics. First, farmers joined forces with trade unions in a massive nationwide single-day strike with 250 million participants. Second, tens and thousands of farmers from Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and Rajasthan participated in the Delhi Chalo, or Let's Go to Delhi march. Predominantly peaceful protesters confronted a militarized police force that attacked them with tear gas, batons, water cannons at the Punjab-Haryana and Haryana-Delhi borders. Police also erected barricades, dug trenches, and in an effort to keep farmers out. Nevertheless, after 2 days of marching, the farmers entered Delhi and established protest camps on the outskirts of the city. For more than a year, farmers organized sit-ins with some 300,000 supporters gathered outside Delhi at the Tikri, Singhu, and Ghazipur borders. And this is what you saw the imagery of in the protest song itself. The BJP government reacted to the ongoing protests by erecting militarized borders around the protest camps, arresting hundreds of protesters. It also charged journalists with sedition, shut down internet services in Delhi and Haryana, ordered Twitter to suspend the accounts of non-compliant news organizations, and then stopped water and electricity to the camps themselves. And the farmers themselves challenged the BJP by showing the world how illiberal the government is, especially in their critiques of the so-called Godi media, that is media that sits in the lap of government. Most national media outlets, in fact, have close ties to the government and are owned by the same corporations that control much of the economy. Criticism of the government is increasingly rare. By labeling its critics as anti-national, the government has effectively used sedition laws to crack down on dissent. As a result, only a few media organizations have maintained their independence. Mainstream media has effectively become a propaganda outlet for the BJP. In response, protesting farmers have founded what is now India's fastest growing newspaper called Trolley Times, which has allowed farmers to produce their own narratives to counter the BJP's propaganda. The BJP has tried to define the protesting farmers as enemies of the state, as separatists, as Maoists, and terrorists. Trolley Times has challenged this kind of coverage, and since it's been published in Gurmukhi and Hindi, what it's done is that it's led farmers from Punjab and Haryana who are linguistically diverse and historically divided to forge solidarities as partners in a mass movement. Although a majority of the protesting farmers have been Sikh, their membership includes Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists, and their practices reflect this diversity. The farmers have engaged in forms of protest based in Gandhian practices of nonviolence and in Sikh practices of loving sacrifice for collective human flourishing, especially through langar or communal kitchen, shahidi or martyrdom, and seva or service. For example, during the Delhi Chalo March, protesters broke through barricades and then cleared the very roads that the police had rigged to stop them. And after clashes with police officers, at least one Sikh temple fed officers who were still dressed in riot gear. These practices rooted in a kind of radical egalitarian, community building, have forged new solidarities across religion, class, language, caste, age, and gender, helping to create an inclusive environment in which Dalits, Muslims, and women are valued. The protests have been likened to Begumpura, literally a city without sorrow, an earthly utopia without caste and class oppression. Originally conceived by the Dalit poet saint Ravi Das, Begumpura has been central to the political imagination of Sikhs and of oppressed populations across India. The protesting farmers have adopted the egalitarianism of a proverbial Begumpura. The farmers have been more progressive than the larger Sikh community, and by drawing on the imaginary of an idyllic city rather than a separate nation state or a Gandhian village, they have sought common cause with dispossessed people across India, and perhaps in the process transformed political aspirations, specifically Sikh political aspirations. If only for a short time, the farmers' protest has created an inclusive democracy, which includes the protest camps and rural support networks. At the camps, basic public services, including schools and libraries, arts and music, and medical and dental camps have been made available to everyone. Communal kitchens have fed hundreds of thousands of people, regardless of religion, class, caste, or gender, thus undermining caste rules of interdining and building heterogeneous coalitions. Beyond the camps, villages across Punjab and Haryana have supported the protesters by sending essential supplies and organizing rotating batches of protesters. And families have divided their time between working the fields and participating in the protest. The work of farmer and laborer unions has been crucial to the success of the farmers' protest, its networked democracy, and its ability to overcome previous caste and class animosities. Landowning farmers who are high caste Jats have a history of oppressing landless farm laborers who are primarily Dalits. But at this moment, their interests have aligned because of the dangers posed by the deregulation of the agricultural sector. This solidarity has been evident in one of the movement's key slogans, long live farmer laborer unity. This alignment of unions, which have been largely secular and socialist, has helped forge new solidarities across religion, class, and caste. And these solidarities have deepened during the protest, with farmers and laborers living, eating, and organizing together. The movement also owes its success to the labor and leadership of women, which has been fostered in part by responding to women's experience of gendered violence at large and in the protests themselves. Women's contribution to the farmers' protest has been celebrated with headlines proclaiming that women have been leading India's farmers' protest, echoing the praise that we saw with women's leadership at the 2019-2020 Shaheen Bagh protest in Delhi. Nevertheless, women in the farmers' protest, much like women in the Occupy movement, have had to navigate threats of gendered violence. The movement has been progressive in many ways, but it still embodies gendered inequities. In response, some women in the protest joined forces with the nationwide network, Women Against Sexual Violence and State Repression, and called on farmer leaders to make the movement safer for women. And the question I think that remains unanswered, right, is about what happens, right, when protesters return to their villages. What will these inclusive solidarities travel with them and lead to changes in religious, class, caste, and gender norms? Will we see a new kind of democratic practice that seeks to build Begampuras in the here and now? Or will these solidarities wither once the imminent threat of the farm laws has passed? So to kind of bring us to this moment in time, on November 19th, 2021, Prime Minister Modi acquiesced to the farmers' demands and announced the repeal of the 3 farm laws. On December 9th, 2021, the farmers formally suspended their protest, but they warned that it would resume if Modi reneged on his promise. It was a rare retreat by the veritable juggernaut of Indian politics, perhaps signaling the twilight of this Raj. On January 31st, 2022, the farmers' protest resumed its agitation as the government continues to renege on its promises. And when they resumed it, they called it the day of betrayal, marking the way that Modi has reneged, especially around MSP and other concerns. So what can movements like the farmers' protest teach us about democracy? In Gezi Park, protesters created a radical democratic public space that challenged authoritarianism. They established a culture of mutual care where everything from food to water to medical treatments and books was free of charge. Similarly, the farmers' protest created a protest with compassion, where many public services were accessible to all, forms of membership and belonging were inclusive, and citizens felt safe and empowered. Both the farmers' protests and those at Gezi Park made use of religion to create new solidarities, with the former embracing Sikh practices and the latter embracing Islamic practices. These protests demonstrate that an embrace of religion is not antithetical to liberal democracy. Religious practices, in fact, might serve to protect liberal democracy by enabling coalitions across religion, class, language, caste, age, and gender. To understand movements like Gezi Park and the farmers' protest, political scientists need to understand how, even for a short time, protests can be both places of being and becoming, in which egalitarian political imaginaries can be envisioned and enacted, heterogeneous political subjectivities can emerge, and robust solidarities rooted in inclusive social practices and norms can be created. The farmers' protest demonstrates hope by highlighting the promise of democracy in action, precisely at the moment when an increasingly authoritarian regime seeks to close it down. So I will stop there and we can kind of open it up to questions and comments.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. And you have raised a whole range of issues that I think are ready for exploration. As everybody takes some time to think about how they'd like to possibly pose a question or a comment, I'd like to raise a few issues that came up that speak to some of your writings on this topic. And there are several that I think would be useful for us to talk about in the context of both a class on the histories of Punjabi migration, as well as this moment. So those are two issues that have been discussed by us just before your talk. One I was wondering if you could say a bit more about is the Swaminathan report of 2006, which was not implemented. And this is a report that, as you mentioned in some of your writings, recommended all sorts of changes to the state of affairs with the Mandi system and the minimum support pricing system, and then was not implemented, and appears to be a pretty major precursor to what has happened in the 2010s and in 2020. And I'm wondering if it's a simple, not simple, but a direct result of the rise of the BJP administration, but I'm sure there's much more to that story. And then also, I was wondering if you could say a bit about the present day and the nature of the so-called reneging that you mentioned at the end of your presentation.
So I'll start with the Swaminathan report. So the report itself, it was commissioned by the government, and the story I think is not as simple as BJP because, or the rise of kind of Hindu nationalism, that's part of the story, but the report was commissioned by the government and no party took it up, right? So the Congress hasn't taken it up, BJP hasn't taken it up. But what the report does, and does very well, is that it does address all of the kind of significant problems that we see in Indian agriculture. And so that's minimum support price. They actually say that MSP should be calculated at 50% of the cost of production. And then it should, they also say that MSP should be that it should be expanded beyond just wheat and paddy, which are the two crops that it currently covers or primarily covers. And so they want a much more robust kind of expansion of MSP to a whole, like the farmers are saying all crops and to all farmers, and Swaminathan report is similarly saying, right, it must be expanded. And then the other piece, what the report does well is to address farmer suicide. And part of what they're saying is that farmers need some access of some levels of control and access to resources, that they should actually have more access to markets, right? They should have more access to insurance mechanisms, to kind of more inputs, right, for the agricultural process. And so that's all addressed in the report. And then the last thing that is the major thing that's addressed is the environmental concerns, because that's the other piece of this, is that with the Green Revolution, right, there was an increased use of pesticides, but also an increased use of water, and this bringing in of paddy into Punjab, which it is not a rice cultivating area, right, but it was brought in. And so water levels continue to be depleted. And so all of this was addressed in the report, but then the no party that's been in power has taken up the report and implemented the changes that are recommended there. But then the BJP actually went a step further to not just ignore the report, but to adopt reforms that just do nothing, right? Like they don't address the underlying problems at all, but actually open up farmers to more uncertainty, more and kind of strip away the very little kind of safety net that they do have. And so that was the first question around Swaminathan report. And then the second question around the kind of reneging of the promises. So there were a few things that were agreed upon. And the farmers negotiated with the Modi government that they would, that the laws would, the 3 farm laws would be repealed, and that piece did happen. And that's huge because, you know, Modi really has not backed down on much. And so to get that was huge. But the pieces that have not come into play, or that they had agreed that there would be a committee that would be created around MSP, and that committee would have representation from the farmer protest, right? The farmers themselves would have some level of representation on that committee. That committee has never been created. And so that is one of the reasons that they are back to protesting. Another is that there were all the lawsuits against farmers who participated in the protest were supposed to be dropped because they've been wrong, detained and have all these legal cases pending against them. And so that was supposed to happen, but neither the federal government nor the state level governments have actually done any of that. There was also a minister in UP, there was a BJP minister whose son actually killed protesters while they were protesting. He ran them over with his vehicle, and that individual has not been arrested. There have been no charges against him, and rather what the government has done is to detain protesters who were there and wrongfully kind of accuse them. And so the protest movement is demanding, right, that this individual be arrested and charged. And so these are some of the things that they have reneged on and still remain to kind of that the protesters are pushing towards and demanding.
Great, thank you so much. There's much more that I would love to ask about, but I'm going to make sure that there's time for others who have questions or comments. And I see one hand by Yishong Fu. I'd like to ask Yishong to ask his question.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bose. Thank you, Natasha. Your speech is very amazing. Thank you very much. I think the most important thing I learned from your speech is that democracy is not only about voting, it's also about compassion, equality, people's solidarity. It's about culture and feelings. You see, democracy was built up in many developing countries, not only India, but in many developing countries, they failed one by one. Why? I think that culture is very important in this regard. However, my question is that can this egalitarian, radical, inclusive spirit of peasants' protest be institutionalized in the Indian political system? I mean, can the protest and the power of these farmers ultimately lead to a systematic change of the degraded Indian democracy, or it just won a single battle. If it cannot make a nationwide change, when democracy was degraded on the national level, is it possible for individual regions to preserve democracy locally? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. So there's a couple of ways of responding. So one is that in this specific protest, the farmers' protest has been very careful to not get involved in politics. They have really not allowed any kind of political party to be affiliated with the movement. They themselves, they didn't, for example, they didn't allow any political speeches from their kind of assemblies and stages. They didn't let anyone who was affiliated with a political party, speak. There was a farm leader, union leader, who at one point said that he wanted to get involved, that the farmers should get involved in upcoming elections. He was sanctioned and wasn't allowed to participate in the farmers' protest for something like 4 weeks. That same individual then, before the Punjab elections, which happened in February, and we got the results in March, did create a party, right? And with a name that was quite similar to the movement's name. And so he did create a party that was centered around farmers and the farmers' protest. And the movement actually distanced itself from him, not from the union that he is part of, but from him individually. And so they've been very careful to make clear that this is a movement, not this is not about kind of institutional party politics, right? Like they want to make that distinction. But then the question is, what you're asking is, right, like, so what impact do they have on democracy? And to what extent can they actually save that democracy? Is it happening in more kind of localized ways or in specific states or places? And I think that it is happening, right? So in Punjab, we saw a clear shift in the way that we think of electoral democracy. And so in Punjab, there was some talk that maybe there'd be some shifts in the UP when it came to the most recent elections, and we saw a decrease in the voting for the BJP, right? But we didn't see any kind of shift in the party. BJP won UP elections, but in in Punjab, we saw something that we've never seen before. Akalis did not win any seats. Congress party really didn't win. They were swept, and the Aam Aadmi party is the party that really came into power in Punjab. So we see a shift electorally based on what has happened in the movement. But the other piece is we need to think of democracy as more than elections, right? And if we understand the impact of the movement beyond electoral politics, I think that there's something significant happening. And so here, right, like there's multiple ways to think of democracy, right? There's an internal democracy of the movement itself that I think is important to recognize. And then there's this, I think, potential, right, that they're building something that is different, right, that is far more inclusive than what we see nationally. And I think we need to recognize that this is important because what it is an imagining of an alternative political kind of vision, right? It's this political imaginary that can be tapped into, that has been created and is, I think, important to recognize, even if it doesn't always result in kind of electoral success. And I think in political science, at least, there's a really narrow understanding of success when we think about these kinds of movements. And I think that what we need to actually do is to see that, these political imaginaries are important, right? And even if they're short-lived, right, but they've enacted something. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, study that, and see what it opens up.
Thank you for that. I would like to now invite Neha to ask her question.
Thank you, Professor Behl, for this very informative presentation. I would like to ask you, based on our readings for this week's class and your presentation, the farmers' movement is mostly concentrated in Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, and parts of Rajasthan. Why doesn't it has taken shape in other parts of India like Maharashtra and South India, where similar problems have been faced by farmers, like a huge debt and farmer suicides? So I'm just wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the unions in Haryana and Punjab were really active the minute that this law was where it became public, right? Like and so we saw that there were these like educational campaigns that started in the summer of 2020. And then after the educational campaigns, then there was major kind of organizing in the rural spaces in Punjab and Haryana. And then they moved from the rural areas to more urban areas within those two states. And then only after that, when they didn't get much traction, did they choose to go to Delhi. And so I think it's those educational campaigns. And I think it's the unions that have had some, that built up the relationships, right, at the village level, that really helped to kind of cultivate what we saw in the farmers' protests and why so many were coming from Haryana and Punjab. And then the other piece is, right, that's where the Green Revolution happened, right? And so we just have, and that's why you've got, I think even, it is the way of life, right, in those places. And there was a real kind of existential threat that was felt, that this would wipe, would take people's land and their way of life from them.
Thank you for that. We have time, I think, for one, possibly two more questions. I will invite Pankaj to ask his question, please.
Hello, thank you. Hello, Professor Behl. Thank you for the session. And I'm a former Sun Devil as well, so it's good to see you, hear you. One of the questions I have is regarding the acceptability of similar kind of protests in a democracy, and especially the role of Indian media in this protest. So I was a close observer of this protest, and I come from Punjab, so I understand the agriculture economy there. One of the things that happened during the protest was the moment it started, right from day one, Indian media was very much villainizing the farmers, calling them secessionist, pro-Khalistan, and it kind of painted them in a very bad light in the rest of the country, especially amongst the Hindu population of the country. And I think in my circle, at least, I saw that in the Punjabi Hindu community, the support for the farmers was very less, in fear of the Khalistani, quote unquote, Khalistan element becoming more active from there. And then after that, the similar kind of, and then there was use of force, and of course, which got people's empathy towards the farmers. But when we saw a similar kind of blockade happening in Canada, and then like Justin Trudeau evoking emergency powers, and then I think that gave the BJP a very major narrative that look what Canada is doing, right? So we were right in controlling the blockade. So my question was like, one, in a country like India, which is struggling to retain its democracy, the role of media, which is very much sided towards the government, and also like the playbook of the protest and acceptability of the kind of protests in democracies, which should be consistent. Like a blockade for something should be treated same, while one shouldn't get a free pass by looking at what happened in a certain Western country.
Thank you for raising both of those issues. So I think the media has played a very much like a key role. And so what you saw was that regional kind of local media was doing an amazing job, right? So like Punjabi, TV stations and Punjabi newspapers, and then we could say the same about the kind of each of these states. You had this really robust local level media that was doing an excellent job providing coverage, and then you had international media that was also doing, I think, an outstanding job at trying to cover this, right, in a meaningful way. And then you had the kind of national level media in India that did exactly what you said, right? To call them Khalistani, to question them, to say they're anti-national, and then even points to say, oh, they're just rich farmers, right? That somehow that it became, right, like the narrative. And so all of that's where the kind of both social media and Trolley Times, I think, played a huge role, because that was a way that the protest itself could create its own narrative and get that information out, right? And then the local level media was covering it and the international was covering it. And that it was actually a good counterweight, right, to what was happening in the country. Then the piece of like, who gets to protest, right? And like who's seen as an appropriate person to protest. This is really, I think, important, because the other reason that they were able to break through the anti-national kind of frame was because this wasn't Shahin Bagh. These were not, it wasn't a Muslim majority, protest, right? The minute with Shahin Bagh, that Muslim rhetoric did take hold, and that did, right, like that kind of anti-national frame did take hold. But here, what the farmers did, they were really strategic and really careful to not go down the Khalistan path, right? To always kind of be very deft in how they navigated that internally and externally. They also were very careful to say it's not a Sikh protest. They said it's a farmers' protest, and it's a farmers' protest that is highly diverse. And the category of farmer, I think, is important and significant, because it is a category that has a degree of kind of like, there's still patriotism tied to it, right? And there's respectability tied to it. And often for most people in India, they can still tie themselves back to farming, right? Or to agriculture in some way, or to villages in some way, right? 60% of the kind of economy is tied to farming to this point, right? And many are only kind of one generation removed from farming, even those, right, who are in urban spaces. And so that category of farmer was key. And that's what they mobilized around and built the solidarities across these other differences while coming together around the category of farmer, which wasn't so easy to say that farmers are anti-national, right? That farmers are separatist and Maoist and whatever other category you want to use. But it was extremely difficult, right? Like it was a very narrow path, and they did manage to navigate it.
Thank you for that. And I think at this point, we're just about 1 minute away from the end. If there are no other hands raised, I'm going to ask our speaker, Professor Behl, if she has any, and there's one that I will ask to make concise, because we only have 1 minute left, but I'll ask Sudhir Jain to ask his question, please.
Well, that was a great presentation, but I have one point to make. I think the farmers' protest was more to do with an agitation by the farmers to protect themselves from a privatization of the marketing process, the sowing process rather than a protest against the authoritarian nature of BJP. How would you react to that?
I think that you're absolutely right. So I think that, yes, that's what it was, but I think it was both simultaneously. And that's what I think is important. And so what doesn't come across in the paper that was shared with the group is the part that you just addressed, right? So the movement was anti-corporate, anti-capitalist, right? And very much concerned with the deregulation. But it was simultaneously, right? The signs that they were holding up were that they are protecting both Indian democracy and Indian agriculture. And so they saw it, I believe they saw it as both, not as one or the other.
Can I respond to that? But the election results, UP and Punjab, from where most of these protesters came, Punjab and Western UP, they show that their political message failed. Even AAP, which came in Punjab, never promoted or supported the farmers' protest. AAP came not because of a change of the political system that the farmers initiated, but because of the corruption of both the major parties, Congress and the Akalis. Just a
no. And so what I think may happen is that AAP, you're right, AAP did not support the protests, and AAP in some ways is kind of like Hindu nationalism light, right? But what I think may happen is that in part in Punjab, the farmers' protests did create this kind of need, right? This demand for change, right? Something different. And that's why these parties, as you said, right, like have been Congress and Akali were swept. But I think that maybe AAP, and who knows, this is right, an empirical question that we have to wait to see what happens. But AAP may, if it wants to remain in power, right, if there has been the kind of shift that I'm saying maybe has happened amongst the kind of Punjabi constituency, AAP may have to shift, right, in its stance if it seeks to be re-elected. But again, these are things that we will see with time, and only with time, right?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think we are just at the end of our program, and I would like to now invite Dr. Behl to offer any last words that she would like to share with us as we close the program today.
And just that it's been an honor. Thank you so much for having me. And this class, the speaker series has been just fantastic, and I'm just humbled and honored to be included.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for being with us. I'll just make a few quick announcements. Next week, our talk is with Anjali Gara-Roy, who will deliver her presentation at 7:30 p.m. Pacific time. So just as a reminder for that. And we have hosted Professor Behl here virtually before, but we hope to do so in person. And I look forward to that opportunity at some point in the future. I'll ask Professor Behl to stay on, and for all the students to stay with us as well. And to everyone else, I hope to see you next week.